and welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, a discussion series in the intersect of philosophy of science and theology. In this series, we'll be focusing on topics on time and memory. My name is Buki Fatona. I'm a researcher here at the University of Oxford in philosophy of science and religion. Some of our interviewees will also be from the University of Oxford, whilst others will be from further afield. Enjoy.
The first question here is, your research in philosophy of science, as I've said, centers on paleoclimatology. What, in your opinion, is the relationship between modeling the past in paleoclimatology and memory? And I think it may be helpful to many listeners, including me, to explain what paleoclimatology is to begin with.
Yeah. So paleoclimatology is the study of climates of the past. And it's something that we interact with sort of, if only subconsciously, in a lot of our ordinary discourse in the current moment, because we talk about climate change and we talk about, mass extinctions or radical changes to the planet in the past and what the temperature was like in the past. And you might think, wait a second, how do we know what the temperature was like in the past? Because nobody was there to write it down. How do we know that all of the glaciers melted at some point, or that the Earth, like, how do we figure this stuff out, right? And so paleoclimatology is really what I study is this very narrow part of it, but trying to reconstruct temperature records. So how has the temperature varied over the history of the Earth? And I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher scientist, so I don't actually figure out how the temperature has varied. What I'm interested in is, how the heck do you figure that out, right? Like, what sort of inferences do you even make? And what kind of, like, how do you sort between a reliable inference to the temperature 1,000 years ago and an unreliable inference to the temperature 1,000 years ago? And it's a particularly interesting field, I think, for a philosopher of science, because it pushes on this real critical juncture in science, which is a lot of science and scientific methodology and like scientific knowledge construction is centered around observing and naming and codifying regularities. And a lot of climate patterns and like current study into climate is about changing patterns. And so it's really interesting to think about, how do we use the knowledge we have of what things are like now, try to project it into a past that we think was very different. That's kind of like the sort of inferential questions and epistemic questions that I think to be at the heart of my field of like paleoclimatology. So a more basic example is something like, using tree rings to try to analyze what the temperature was 500 years ago, and you do this like through what are called proxy measurements or indirect measurements, and you look at the growth in the tree rings and how temperature fluctuations affects changes in tree ring size or gaps between the rings, and then you use that to kind of project it into models of what the temperature was like, to sort of, I don't want to say fabricate, we'll say reconstruct. and again, this is why I say constructive, right? There's definitely a constructive element going on here. We're constructing these records from the past, but we're trying to do it with an evidential basis and a good inferential grounding from that evidence. And so I sort of study, how do you do that? What counts as good evidence? How does the fact that this is deep in the past change what we take to be a good inference? How does it sort of shift what we might think to be the most foundational points of our scientific framework? Like maybe we lean on a different leg on the stool, so to speak, when we have to go deep into the past. So stuff like that. That's what I'm interested in. So part of what we do in paleoclimatology is we try to reconstruct records of the past, of different climate variables and what they were like, of different states of the ocean and what they were like. And we also compile these sort of independent records sometimes into larger models to try to understand, or we can use them to construct models of how things might have gone down in the past. So one particular really interesting area of research on this has to do with the Permian extinction. And that is the largest known extinction. And why people are so interested in it right now is because they think it was probably triggered by a carbon event, maybe a volcanic eruption or something like that. But so part of what we want to know is like, okay, well, what went down when there was too much CO2? How did that affect change? And thinking that if we can get a picture of that narrative. So we try to, people will use computers to model in various ways. How might these different factors have been working together? How can we get a sense of the way the climate was changing over time? What climate systems were most heavily impacted? And that can even give us more specific insight into what kind of interventions we could make in light of climate change. Like if we know like certain systems are more vulnerable and really trigger higher impacts, like can we think of ways to shore up those systems, those kinds of questions. But so when we model the past, we sometimes try to reconstruct what we know of as past climate events and imagine sort of the story of Earth. And I do think we think of the Earth as remembering and as it's interesting. I don't know that we think of it just as remembering so much as we think of it as recording. I think the key term that gets used, and I have not thought much about how recording and remembering are related, but it might be interesting to do that right now. But when I think about the scientific approach to the past, a lot of it is records. And even with the idea of proxies. So I said before that people say proxies are indirect measurements. And there's some philosophical discussion about what does that mean and what makes a proxy an indirect measurement. Like, because we always use measurement systems that are some sense indirect. Like even if I use a thermometer to take your temperature, I'm looking at how the mercury changes and making an inference to a temperature, and all of that's indirect. But what I think, so I actually have an account, what I think is different about the proxies is that normally the way science works is we'll take a series of measurements and record those measurements. But in the proxy case, we get a record and we have to sort of extract the recording method. It's a very like inverse of the process. So it's indirect because we start with a record and not a measurement. That's what I think is unique about this style. But this is a philosophical opinion, so I don't want to say this as scientific fact. But so you're in this situation where you're working backwards, right? You get a record of some measurements. You get this record of tree rings. And now we've got to go from that record to some kind of reconstruction of the events that generated it. And it's a skewed reconstruction insofar as we're usually interested in particular variables and their role in making that record, even though we don't think that they directly made the record, nor did some agent make the record with the intention of preserving those specific variables in the way that we make temperature records now. So it's a really different epistemic situation. How is it like memory? I mean, we think that, yeah, I guess we think that stuff really happened, that something has been impressed on the world, that there was some shared story that unfolded among the earth. And in that sense, I guess it's like a kind of remembering. I guess it's like a kind of remembering in that part of remembering is to fix our attention on the past. And so insofar as we pay attention to those records or try to look to them, it's like remembering. But yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the real kind of metaphor or the kind of grounding metaphor of the practice is the idea that the earth holds a record of its history, and that like what happens affects, that there's these mutual relationships between the, within the ecosystem and all of the organisms of Earth. And so we have this shared recording of history.
No, I think you make a really helpful distinction there about how between the recording versus remembering. And I think one thing that immediately struck me was it feels necessary for remembering to have, well, I guess not necessary, but for conscious memory, it feels like you need a conscious agent or a perceiver to have that memory. I guess there are subconscious and probably unconscious memories, and that takes us into another area. I think the most salient point, but you didn't use this word, was about causation. So it looks like when you look at the recordings of the Earth in relation to what took place in the past, you're looking at them from trying to investigate their cause, which is not the purpose usually for why we remember. We're not always interested in the causal processes per se. We look at what they've already caused or what they've already done for us, or they trigger other memories. But this is quite the stance being in response to these recordings seemed to me to be slightly different from just daily memories. So it was helpful. It looks like you have something to add to that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm thinking about, I don't know. I mean, again, for me, this is a very exploratory area. I have not thought a lot here, but when I think about how we use memory in our daily life, well, it is interesting. So something that I have thought about in relation when I was thinking about your questions was, are we thinking about conscious memories, or are we thinking about something like muscle memory? Because muscle memory, I think, is more of the sort of analogy we're probably working with when you're doing paleoclimatology. You think that some recollection is just stored in you, and we can kind of untangle it through some kind of causal reasoning, right? Because it's the thought is that there is a causal connection between what's happened and your past. And I do think with muscle memory, we think of that as being causal, like you undergo some bodily movement enough that it leaves this kind of mark that's just a part of you. But that's not the same as conscious memory. I've not thought as much about connection to conscious memory. I do think we sometimes draw on our conscious memory to look for situations that were similar and see if we can apply whatever we've gleaned from them in a new way. And that to me seems very analogous to what people are doing with like Permian research, right? Where we find a situation that we think is similar and we're sort of looking at it to see if we can learn from it. That seems like something we do with our conscious memory. But in terms of the trees having a conscious memory, I don't think I think of it that way. I think, you're thinking of it as something like muscle memory or something like an impression or something like a mark, some kind of causal relationship.
No, that's helpful. But what occurred to me takes us off tangent because I thought about if you were a panpsychist, for example, then maybe you'd be thinking of the Earth as having conscious memories, and then the metaphor changes somewhat.
Yeah, I think you could. Although I think even in that case, as a scientist, you can't access the conscious memories the way that you would access them with a different kind of perceiving agent. So even if like I think that the tree has conscious memories, I don't have any kind of access to the tree's consciousness of its memory. I only have access to the marks, like the visible marks.
In your work, do you use different models or a particular conception of memory?
Yeah, I think I would say that in our work, really, insofar as I have a conception of memory, it's going to be a record. I think that is, I don't know, we would call that a conception of memory, but I think that's the driving force is a record, a recording.
Yes, but I wonder if this helps because competing, because for a long time that kind of way of looking at memory as a recording or as an archive kind of dominated
Hmm.
the way we thought about memory. But a competing theory is that memories just are constructed right now in the moment. The, it would take too long to explain about causation and that kind of memory, but they are constructed much like imagination in the way we think about the future, for example, is how we remember the past. So there is more a work of imagination than just going into an archive and retrieving a recording. And I wonder if that helps the way you look at the past
Yeah.
or model the past.
Well, it's interesting because in some ways, I would say if we're constructing memories right now, what are we constructing them from? So there's, again, I definitely think there's a sense of construction that happens here, especially when we're trying to construct temperature records. And if you think about even the way we categorize temperature, it's all relying on modern instruments, on modern conditions that allow us to use these instruments. I mean, there's this great, so Hasek Chang wrote this wonderful book called Inventing Temperature. And there's this aside where he talks about when they were sort of inventing the temperature scale. At some point, they realized there was this certain kind of dust that was everywhere in England, but not in Scotland or something. I'm probably telling the story wrong, but it made the errors a little bit off outside of England, but it was okay because everyone was in England that was doing this, so they could just ignore it. But those little things, when you are trying to go back 10,000 years, start getting really big. And the way, so I guess I tend to think of it as a record, but I also think there's a sense where we're taking our current categories. So you might think of temperature, we're taking our understanding of temperature now or our models of the climate now and trying to couple them up with these records of the past in a way. And there's something very constructive happening in that process. Um, so I do think there's this element of that occurring as well, but it's hard for me to think of the model as just like pure construction in the moment, because we certainly think that we are constructing off of a archival record, but how we read that record, our interpretation of it is going to draw from the present moment in a very serious way.
Again, that's really helpful. I guess even a constructivist take of memory would still say you're aiming at something in the
Mm,
same way you're aiming at the past, you're aiming at an event that has occurred. So there is something that you are aiming at, is not just spiraling in
right.
the dark. But then what it is, there's giving you the material to make that construction becomes more complicated. But
Mm,
then I guess that's probably as far as you can push the analogy anyway, because we're talking about different materials, different substances.
yeah.
The third question is this, and in a 2017 paper published in Oxford Studies of Philosophy of Religion, entitled The Posture of Faith, you develop a novel account of faith. How do you see the relationship between this novel account of faith and memory? That is, does faith require memory? For example, can someone with memory loss have faith even if they no longer remember the concept God?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So the way that I try to define faith in that paper is relying on a model that connects it to posture. So rather than thinking, and in a lot of ways, it was a response to more doxastic accounts of faith, where faith is like a measurement of how strongly you believe something. I think of faith as a kind of orientation towards something, or how you orient your life and towards some, could be goal, purpose, person. But faith being more this sort of attitudinal category, um, and thinking about it as a posture. So in that sense, I think you could have faith with memory loss, because you could still be postured towards the thing. I think it's interesting because to what degree does our memory or inability to remember, or the way we remember things, affect our posture? And I think that's what's really interesting. Even thinking about memory in the, like, in faith traditions, why people think that it's the connection between memory and faith, I would say, is that these memories are supposed to draw us deeper into the posture of faith. So if you think of faith as a leaning attitude and a trusting attitude, and then having a certain kind of confidence towards, desire towards this kind of stuff attitude, the way we tell those memories are supposed to be, they're supposed to be told in ways to help that orientation. Um, but yes, so I guess I don't particularly think of the question of faith. So, and again, this was like a reactionary, my account was like a reactionary account, because a lot of people think of analyzing faith in terms of your quantity of belief or something, how strongly you believe something, or the relationship between belief and evidence. And part of what I was trying to show in those papers is I don't think it's purely, or maybe even mostly, an intellectual attitude, which isn't to say that it's completely detached from belief, but I was arguing that it's more a kind of life orientation. So yes, I do think you could have that with memory loss. And again, here I want to say, what sort of memory loss are we thinking about? Is it like loss of conscious memories? Because in the posture analogy, muscle memory becomes very important. So if you think that the experiences of your life are stored within you at a more subconscious level, then this would be really important in like how your attitudes are oriented and how you shape your projects. And that wouldn't necessarily be altered by a kind of conscious memory loss.
It's fascinating. In the last season, I spoke to Professor Robert Gilbert, who is a biophysicist, and he said, and I won't be able to quote him at verbum, he said something about scientists as well as theologians have adopt a stance of faith in their work. And I wonder if your account of faith has a capacity to explain that. Is it just a theist account, or is it an account that accounts for all forms of faith?
I was trying to account for all forms of faith. I wasn't trying to account in particular for religious faith. I was trying to give some kind of picture of faith in which you could situate like a plurality of kinds of faith. Um, so yeah. So yes, it would be that I think it's more about like how it can act as a motivator. So if you think of having faith as having a certain kind of motivation, and a kind of approach motivation where you're willing to go closer and closer towards an object, um, it can apply to like any object. And I think that this can be true of the scientist who wants to study the world, and I think it's like, I think of Gregory of Nyssa. This is I'm not a theologian, but the idea that we're constantly seeking God, that you go further and further in, and that it's always the response of faith to go deeper in, which is why I think this idea of a posturing, of a leaning towards, is a better way of capturing what I think of as the essence of faith than some kind of certain commitment to a proposition or even to a person. I think it really has to do with the degree to which we invest our lives, our times, our resources into our projects and what those projects are.
I mean, that leads to two really quick questions on which to end. The first is that, so is faith something that comes before or after belief? Is it prior to it, or is it a precursor even to belief, or something that flows out of it? And then the second is, how do you see it? How do you see faith in the work that you do on paleoclimatology?
Oh gosh. So the first question, does belief come before faith or faith come before belief? Something I really liked about the posture account is that it tracks with the ambiguity of that question. Because I think that's a very chicken egg question, and I think any good account of faith should preserve it. And I think the posture one sort of does, because it's like, well, there's gotta be something in order to lean. But if you have a positive response to that kind of leaning towards or leaning in, you're gonna lean more, right? And so it seems like you have to have some faith to generate faith, but it also seems like as you lean and get responses, that it tends to increase. So I think it's kind of iterative. I think faith is an iterative process. Um, as to the second question, how do I see faith in what I do? I mean, look, I think we have a kind of faith that history happened and that there were events in the earth. And I think it's wild. I mean, I fell into this because I'm like, wait, you're telling me that people are reading the temperature of the earth 1,000 years ago by cutting up ice cores? That's wild. But the kind of results that they've gotten are so beautiful and interesting. And I think it takes a kind of faith to sit in that tension, to ask these big questions and to not answer them quickly, but to really wonder and think of how we can resolve them. Um, to look at them with an open mind, to wonder and be curious, all of these things that I think of as being associated with a kind of faith, a willingness to take risks and lean in and try things and work. I mean, as a scientist, you don't know if your experiments are going to work out, and it's a lot of work to go to Antarctica and freeze. And oh my gosh, I know one scientist who's like, my first dissertation melted because the packing company that was supposed to ship it back to the lab like didn't have the right kind of refrigeration. So you go in and you drill into this ice and you look at it and you analyze it and you have to think about it, and who knows what's going to happen. It's so much work, but you need a kind of faith and a kind of hopefulness, I think, to give yourself the space to focus and to give your research and to give the earth and these material art, like artifacts, really the kind of focus and attention they deserve. You have to really give your attention and your thought to these specimens and have some kind of belief that you're doing that produces knowledge. I think that's a real kind of faith.